So now we're going to move into what is very likely the most important piece of information that we can obtain from stars, and that is their spectra. We take the light, of course the light being the only thing that we can really get from the stars, and we pass it through a diffraction grating, or essentially through a prism, and we break it out into its spectrum, and then we see typically what we see is an absorption spectra. So just to remind you, an absorption spectra is the gases in the atmosphere are cooler, and so therefore as the light passes through them, certain characteristic wavelengths that are characteristic of that particular atom get absorbed and then re-emitted, but it's very unlikely they get re-emitted in the same direction. And so what we ultimately end up seeing is little dark lines. This is actually the spectra of one of the stars visible in the nighttime sky. And essentially what they've done is taken the spectra and chopped it up so that they could put it in this format. But essentially what we should do is take each little stripe here and cut all these little stripes out and then lay them end to end. Now obviously I would have a difficult time showing that. This particular one would be about 20 or 30 feet long if we were to do that. So because the spectra contains many thousands of lines, this is often a way that we would be able to represent it. And this is very typical for a star. And you can see that there are a tremendous number of lines. Now every atom produces its own particular characteristic lines. So what we would do is we would see what wavelengths are being given off. You see there's a lot of these little double lines. We would look at these and then we would identify what atoms that are made from the star, I should say, what its atmosphere is made of. Now, there's kind of two ways we can look at the spectra. We can look at a spectra in this format, in which we see the little dark lines, or we can look at the spectra in this format, in which what we essentially do is we look at the intensities. So in other words, we count how many of this color photon, how many of these orange-red photons, how many of this green photon, how many of this green photon, how many of this green photon. And so every place where you see a little dark line in here, that corresponds to a little dip in this graph. Now obviously, this entire spectra, which goes back and forth across the page about 30 or 40 times, is all being jammed into this little space. So it's very difficult for us to see the little blips, the little dips in here, where the amount of light is greatly reduced because, again, that's being absorbed by the atoms in that particular star's atmosphere. But you will notice that it shows that same relationship that we just saw before with Wien's law. That is that at very low temperatures, you find that they give off more of the red than they give off of the blue, and the peak is way over here. That's these stars down here at the at the bottom. So you notice that their intensity is very low over here at the short wavelengths, and as the wavelengths get longer and longer and longer, they're sliding up, just like you'd expect to see right here. This is a very low temperature star. The stars in the middle, they kind of peak in the visible portion of the spectrum. So that's going to be like these guys. You can see each of these guys peaks in the visible portion of the spectrum, but one of the things that you'll notice is that for these two at the bottom, their peak is off here to the right. But starting with this guy, this is the first one where the peak is just about on the edge of the paper here, on the edge of the graph, on the edge of the visible portion of the spectrum. The next one up, this is definitely in the visible portion of the spectrum, and this is essentially the characteristic spectra of our sun right there. And then as we move up, what we see is that the peak is moving farther and farther to the left. The peak is in the visible. Peak is in the visible, in the visible, in the visible. As we approach up here to the top, we start to see these stars. And these are the stars in which the peak is actually off of the visible. It's out here in the ultraviolet portion of the spectrum. And that's these top three stars right here. All right, so these are the very hot stars, and then essentially what's happening as we move down through these spectral lines is we're getting lower and lower and lower in temperature, and we're seeing that peaks shift from out of the visible to the left, to being in the visible portion of the spectrum, to being out of the spectrum in the infrared portion. So this is sort of similar to what we saw in Wien's law when we were looking at it, except now we can actually look at what's being lost, the little portions that are being lost. The stellar spectra reveals a lot of information about the stars, so let's take a look at what kind of information we can actually get from this spectra. And ultimately, the most important thing that we get from the spectra, I've identified the three most important ones. I put them in bold. Number one most important thing is that we get the chemical composition. Either absorption or the emission spectra would reveal what kind of atoms or molecule make up the atmosphere of the star. Specifically the atmosphere, because the surface of the star is essentially releasing almost every form of light All forms of light are there. And one of the things that you'll notice in this diagram that we looked at before, it's not showing you how much blue or how much green or how much red. It's just showing you that it is present. And of course, all stars give off all the forms of visible light. So while this is revealing in terms of saying where the absorption lines occur, it's not that revealing in terms of telling us how much of the blue or the red or the green, where this graph is a little bit more useful for that purposes. So as a result of the fact that the star's surface releases all the forms of light, but as that light passes through the atmosphere, certain colors will be picked out. It leaves a little chemical fingerprint that allows us to determine what the composition of the star is. Number two, it allows us to determine the temperature, and this is actually through two sort of methods. Number one, we've already seen how when we look at the spectra, how we can see where the peak is, and the peak is going to reveal to us what the temperature of the star is. But also, another sort of interesting aspect is that a star may actually have a particular atom, for example hydrogen, and not show it in its spectra. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit, why that is. But it turns out that seeing what chemicals show up in an atmosphere of a star can help reveal its temperature, because, for example, certain stars that are extremely hot do not show the hydrogen lines, for example. And so a star not showing the hydrogen lines reveals something about its temperature. The third, I would say among the three most important aspects, is the radial velocity. The radial velocity means the velocity of the object either towards or away from us, and that is determined by using something called the Doppler effect. And the Doppler effect is either the red or the blue shift of the spectrum. So remember, red is a longer wavelength, blue is a shorter wavelength. So if the spectral lines, so what I'm referring to are these spectral lines, these little dips, they will shift either to the right or to the left. In other words, the entire spectra will slide over to the right or the left. Similarly with these spectral lines in this diagram. All of these lines will slide over. If they slide, in this case, to the left, meaning that they're moving towards shorter wavelength, that's towards the blue, that means that the object's moving towards us. And if they slide to the right, if all these lines slide to the right, then that means that the object must be going away from us, because everything has been shifted more towards the red. It doesn't mean that the light is red or blue, it just means that it's been shifted towards that side of the spectrum, either the red side of the spectrum or the blue side of the spectrum. So the radial velocity, definitely a really important aspect. It's a relatively easy measurement for us to make. The Doppler effect actually has a dual effect, because if one side of the star is all stars are rotating. So if one of the sides of the star is moving away from us and the other side is moving towards us, we can actually use the Doppler effect to figure out the rotation rate of the star. What essentially the rotation rate of the star does is, instead of getting a sharply defined line, what we end up is getting kind of a fuzzy line, because part of the line, the atmosphere on one side is moving away from us, that red shifted that portion of the line, and then on the other side of the star, that same spectral line has been blue shifted, so what we see is the spectral lines get wider, a little bit fuzzy, and that reveals the rotation of the star. It's a bit of a crude measurement, but it certainly can be done. Magnetic fields can be revealed because when you put an atom, which is either absorbing or emitting spectral lines, in a magnetic field, it causes causes the spectral lines to split. So where normally if there was no magnetic field, you would see a single line, oftentimes you'll see double lines. And those reveal the magnetic strength of the magnetic field of the star.